Hi everyone. So thank you for the organizers for letting me present what is some part of my PhD thesis here. And so today I hope to convince you at least as to why losing biosynthetic functions could be beneficial for some bacterial species. So if you look at genome sizes in bacteria, they vary quite a lot. So the largest one being that of Sorangium cellulosum, about 14 MB in size. It's a common soil bacterium. And the smallest one is that of Castanella, which is a common endosymbiont in most insects. And the difference in genome sizes could be up to 100 degrees of magnitude less. And the more famous members such as Escherichia coli or Bacillus slot right in the middle of this spectrum. And what happens during this genome reduction is that these bacteria tend to throw a lot of genes which are not essential for their functioning anymore. And if you look at the ecologies of these bacteria, then what's like the pattern that emerges is that the ones at this end of the spectrum are largely free living, or they are subject to nutrient poor or frequently changing environments. And what happens for these is that they usually host or restricted to certain environments, and there's a stable array of resources available. So for example, endosymbionts, they're restricted to certain hosts always. And also when there's instances of microbes co-evolving with each other in a very intricate manner. So now prime examples of these include lactic acid bacteria. So these guys have thrown out a lot of biosynthetic genes. There's Prochlorococcus species which predominate in the Earth's oceans, and it's like a common marine bacterium. Insect endosymbionts, as I said earlier. So this is Hodgkinia species in cicadas, and even pathogens such as Listeria. And what's common unifying all these examples is that they've lost some form of metabolic autonomy and instead derive these metabolites from the environment. So Silvio, who's a colleague of mine, and he's going to have a talk tomorrow. So he asked a simple question as to how frequent is the loss of biosynthetic functions, in other words auxotrophy, in bacterial populations. And he did this by looking at about 1400 genomes that were already sequenced. And using the genomic information present in these genomes, he could predict if certain metabolic pathways were present in a certain organism or not. So if certain function could not be made by this in this genome, then it was deemed to be potentially auxotrophic. And what he found is very surprising, that about 58% of eubacteria that he looked at are auxotrophic, at least for one new metabolic function as such. And this analysis is limited to amino acids, growth factors, and nucleotides basically. And so what's also surprising is that frequently they're auxotrophic for more than one metabolite. So the median is around 1 to 3. He also mapped them to the lifestyles according to where bacteria live. So this is kind of expected that endosymbionts lose a lot of metabolic functions, and which is about 80% because they have severely reduced genomes. But what's surprising are these guys. So these are seemingly free living organisms, but there also is a high degree of auxotrophy in them. So what could drive this genome streamlining? So one could be a result of drift, and this is quite possible for, say, insects and endosymbionts and them, because they have small population sizes and they suffer from frequent bottlenecks. But it could also be another explanation that selection could drive this loss. So there's a lot of experimental evolution experiments out there where deletions are adaptive. And so this could be completely plausible for, say, lactic acid bacteria, which evolve in very rich environments such as dairy products or so. So this is what we asked. Can selection account for this loss of biosynthetic functionality in these organisms? And we decided that the best way to measure this is to measure the fitness consequences of gene loss. Now the ideal approach is to go out there and get all the 1400 bacteria that we looked at and do these experiments. But as you know, all of them are not amenable to experiments in the lab. So we decided to answer this question using a common laboratory workhorse, that is Escherichia coli. So there's a whole lot of information available. So there's metabolic pathways are curated. So we could predict which genes to knock out or delete such that the bacterium becomes auxotrophic. So in this case, deleting this ARG-H gene makes it auxotrophic for arginine. And so we had an entire suite of mutants which were auxotrophic for amino acids, growth factors, even certain bases in DNA. And then we just measured the fitness consequences of gene loss in these mutants. And this we did by simple classical competition experiments where we compete equal amounts of wild type and the oxytrophic mutant strain in minimal media, and which just has access to this particular focal metabolite that it requires. And so what we do is, so we mix equal amounts, we plate them at 0 hours, so, and we could distinguish the colonies because they all have phenotypic markers in them, and after 24-hour the strain which is fitter increases in proportion, so it's deemed to be fitter than the other strain. And what we get is a typical dosage response curve. So when we what we plot is relative fitness, so we look at fitness of the oxytroph and normalize it with fitness of the wild type. So in this case, the 1 is the reference wild type line, and if it's above, it's fitter. If it's below, it's not less fit. And so what we see is fit. So for one example is that fitness increases as the concentration of the nutrient increases, and it reaches a point where certain maxima is reached. And so we take this maxima, and for all the mutants now, and we plot them on one graph. And what you see is most mutants, if not all, are much fitter than the wild type. And the increase in fitness is roughly 13% or so if you average it out across all mutants. So there's selective advantage to be oxytrophic when you have the metabolite in the environment for most metabolites. And what's also strongly seen is that there's a concentration dependence. So the vitamin oxytrophs are fitter at much lower concentrations than, say, the amino acid oxytrophs, and this could be generally reflective of the requirements for E. coli for these nutrients. Yep. As I told you earlier, in Silvio's in silico analysis, he always sees that frequently there's multiple functions being lost, and so he asked this question as to how frequently do these losses co-occur with each other. So, for example, valine, how frequent does a valine oxytrophy co-occur with say proline? And the answer is so if it's red here, it's significantly co-occurring than expected by chance. So this means that genetic interactions could constrain the adaptive benefits that we see in the previous experiments. Another factor is that when we did our experiments, we gave access to the bacterial cells to just this specific metabolite that it was oxytrophic to, and there was just the presence of a single carbon source. But natural environments are quite complex. There's changing carbon sources, so bacterium can use probably a multitude of carbon sources, one after each other, or possibly together. And there's also not just one metabolite present out there, so there's a combination of metabolites present out there. So possibly there could also be environmental effects which constrain these selective benefits. So we asked as to what degree do these two factors could constrain the adaptive benefits that accompany gene loss. So we did this via similar experiments. So we had strains which had one oxytrophy, so one metabolic mutation, two oxytrophies, or three oxytrophies. So we had so oxytrophy for three biosynthetic functions. And then we did a similar competition experiment where we competed wild type versus these three oxytrophs, but now in a slightly different condition. So they were given either two different media, so they differed in either fructose as the primary carbon source or succinate as the primary carbon source, and in this case all amino acids were present, so unlike the previous experiment. And then we simply again measure competitive fitness. And you might ask why we choose fructose and succinate. It's primarily because they are co-players in two very important metabolic pathways for E. coli. So fructose being important in glycolysis, and succinate being important in TCA. And what we see, so when we measure these fitness effects, you could split them into two different categories, three in fact. So one is a set of mutations which are much fit in fructose, one set of mutations which have higher fitness in succinate. And so this is again like a fitness effects of these mutations in these two environments. So the orange is fitness in fructose, the gray is fitness in succinate, and these lines basically connect fitness for the same mutation in these two environments. So we see that these mutations have much higher fitness in fructose, whereas there's a class of mutations which have much higher fitness in succinate. And what's also interesting is that certain mutations which have very deleterious effects in one environment are rescued by a simple change in the carbon source. And so this is like evidence for plasticity, and environmental effects can determine what's the selective advantage of loss. And also there's a category where there's primarily no effects, so it's just epistasis which is determining these effects, and if you disentangle the individual effects, they all tend to be significant. So, so there is an effect of genetic background and the environment in determining and constraining the selective advantages. So to summarize my talk, yes, loss of biosynthetic functions is quite widespread, and we could potentially explain this by the selective advantages we see in E. coli. So I've shown you data for E. coli, but we've done it for Acinetobacter bailey. It's a soil bacterium and it's still there. There's been papers reporting it for Bacillus, so it seems to be quite prevalent. And yes, it's determined by genetic and the nutritional environment. But what implications does it have for microbial community functioning? So consider bacterial species, or say E. coli, living in an environment. It has potentially access to a multitude of carbon sources or primary resources you could imagine. And we know that there's enough amino acids out there in the environment, so it could either be by high organisms or simply growth of different bacterial species. So we know that the carbon source can determine the amino acid compositions in the environment. And we know that now that it's beneficial to lose genes when you derive these functions from the environment. And so this could easily lead to the So this could easily lead to the evolution of intricate metabolic complementarities, and this is potentially what's happening in microbial communities out there. So, so I like. Yeah, so just to acknowledge, okay, yeah, I think they're not. So I'd like to thank my group and the organizers, and yeah, Silvio for the close collaboration. So thank you. So I'll be happy to take questions.
All right, questions for Glen?
Harris?
Yeah, so we've also done a lot of these predictions off of genomic sequences, and one of the things, I guess, that's problematic is that the gene prediction or pathway predictions for complete biosynthesis pathways aren't completely accurate. And so sometimes you predict that certain organisms are autotrophic when it hasn't been experimentally validated. So what do you guys do to kind of correct for that type of issue?
So one thing that we've introduced is, so we've introduced the stringency of these predictions. So we don't just look at, so if just so say arginine biosynthesis, there could be 10 genes which are responsible in the pathway. But what Silvio does is he considers a pathway lost or function lost, only 50% of the genes are lost. So it's like we're making it robust to say, but surely there are inaccuracies. So when we did this initially, we saw there was a 70% loss, but now we refine these predictions, and because we know that some databases are wrong, and so we now come to 50. So yes, I mean this is something that you need to correct for, but that's why we introduce this, that 50% of the pathway has to be lost in order.
Jan?
You've looked at a large number of genomes, but are these all genomes from laboratory cultivated organisms, or are they straight from the environment?
Not all are from laboratory cultivated genomes, so some of them are straight from the environment, I think. So,
in that case, how do they differ? Because I mean, first, if you're looking at genome sequences, I guess a large number of genome sequences are from pathogens, which would tend to live in our bodies, so would not tend to need to make amino acids. So I guess I'm asking whether this is biased by having more genomes from pathogens sequenced, or whether they are more genomes from the environment.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean these genomes are heavily represented by this particular class of, say, endosymbiont, so say pathogens or biotechnology relevant organisms. So yeah. This is something we're trying to refine in the analysis. Yeah, but yeah, it's there.
So 10% fitness gain through not having a gene is an awful
Yeah,
lot.
exactly.
I mean, this gene is only costing the cell much less than that.
Yeah.
What do you think explains that?
So exactly. So we were, because 10% for a single gene, and when E. coli has like 4,000 genes, so that's awful lot. So so what we think it's primarily metabolic costs. that's saving, but 10% is too much. So what we think there's a so it doesn't make a difference which gene you lose. There's some global pathway organizing. So we looked at expression analysis on transcriptomes of these E. coli strains, and we find that so you oxytrophic for arginine, but you'll tend to shut off all, say, 20 amino acid pathways. So there's kind of an anabolic economization in these strains, sort of. But yes, and it's also differs. So if we delete the same gene, so if you consider an arginine pathway and we delete different genes in the pathway, the fitness will increase as you go delete genes down the pathway, and the genes up the pathway are don't have like that much positive effect. So it somehow correlates with protein mass.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of looks like the wild type strains are being confused by you put all of the one amino acid in, and somehow it's getting confused by this.
The wild type strain? No, I mean, if you just compare statistically the wild type without amino acids and wild type with any amount of amino acids, there's no difference at our concentrations.
Would you expect a difference there? I mean, if the wild type has to make all the amino acids, or you provide them, should that be?
I mean, typically regulation should act, right? So, I mean, if it has tryptophan, it'll probably shut its own biosynthesis and take it up from the environment. But apparently, this is not happening in these cases.
What about in Rich Lenski's long-term lines? If this is as easy as you indicate for it to happen, and the potential for cross-feeding, his lines ought to be full of auxotrophs and cross-feeding.
I mean, I think in his lines, I think he didn't provide amino acids in his media.
There's got to be excretion or secretion of excess amino acids, and no cross-feed if you make.
Yes. I mean, in his lines, he's not seen this, but I mean, there are experiments. So we've done a similar 2000 generation experiment where we've evolved E. coli in the constant amino acid conditions, and we do see auxotrophies under like high population size in conditions where there's high population sizes. So we do see this evolving. So, but we don't know if it's adaptive or not. But we do find auxotrophs in there. I mean, there's been similar experiments with bacillus where they've evolved them for a long time under amino acids, and there are certain auxotrophs which evolve and have adaptive fitness gains. So yeah, I mean, it possibly requires a certain threshold of carbon source so that the E. coli can feed with, so that there's an increase in amino acid production over time. So yeah, this is.
If there are no more questions, or are there any? Yeah.
Yes, just to pick up on the point you made right at the end of your talk, I get the impression you would argue that these amino acid codependencies can account for a lot of the stability in naturally occurring microbial communities, perhaps which might explain why we have so many problems in the lab. So can you tell me the extent to which it's been demonstrated that these are an important part of codependency in microbial communities in nature?
So to the extent to which, so this
it's been shown that this occurs.
I think not much. So that's what we're at. So we're also planning to look at natural populations to show these independent. I mean, there are a few papers which show cross-feeding is kind of important, but I think there's not much.
Okay, any more questions? If not, we thank Glen again.